Okay, so today, AP Euro, we're doing the Enlightened monarchs. I'm continuing on from last week, talking about the Enlightenment and Enlightened absolute monarchs. Um, let's see. So the Enlightenment, it grows out of the scientific revolution. If you can question authority with regards to the scientific revolution, regarding things like whether or not the universe is geocentric or heliocentric, then it follows that perhaps you can question authority when it comes to matters of society. And shouldn't you be able to perhaps improve upon society itself and make the world a better place for people to live in, so to speak? So the Enlightenment thinkers were concerned about progress, and they were largely optimistic that things could be improved. Of our Enlightenment thinkers, the two that I really want you to know for political reasons are John Locke and Rousseau. John Locke, he writes about a social contract. He writes that men have natural rights, life, liberty, property, and that they enter into a social contract with a limited government, so a constitutional monarchy would appeal to him, and they give up some rights, but in return for peace and stability. And Rousseau also believes this. He believes that men give up rights. In his book, The Social Contract, he argues that men give up rights so that they can be governed by the general will, so to speak. The reason why I really want you to know both John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau is that both men argue that if the government doesn't protect your rights, that you have the right as a people to rise up against that government. This idea of the consent of the governed, that you consent to being ruled. And this is going to be hugely important because, of course, both Locke and Rousseau will largely influence the French revolutionary thinkers, Robespierre, etc. They don't think that the king is listening to them. He's not respecting their rights, and so they have the right to rise up against Louis XVI, so to speak. All right, so I also really want you to know Voltaire because we've spent a lot of time thinking about religion, and one of the ways that the enlightened monarchs are actually enlightened is that they are not like Louis XIV, the absolute ruler who says that everybody in France must be Catholic. All of them embrace, to some extent, religious toleration. And it's Voltaire who writes in his treatise on toleration that in an age of rational thinking, that being intolerant, it's not rational. And remember, Voltaire, he did not like the Catholic Church for its intoleration. He said, crush the thing, speaking about the Catholic Church. So he's intolerant of intolerance, so to speak. That's what he's intolerant of. But he doesn't like the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church was not tolerant toward the Protestants and the Jews. And Voltaire is for toleration of all peoples. Now, of our enlightened monarchs, only Joseph II comes close to meeting what Voltaire is hoping for with regards to toleration. But our other two enlightened monarchs, Catherine of Russia and Frederick of Prussia, they are very much enlightened when it comes to religion in that they allow Lutherans and Calvinists to worship freely. They don't have a problem at all if you're of the Christian faith. It doesn't matter what kind of Christianity. And so even though that might seem like sort of limited enlightenment to us, because we would like them to be tolerant of all religions, you nevertheless have to see it through the lens of history, and that following on the heels of Louis XIV, who says, who revokes the Edict of Nantes with his Edict of Fontainebleau and forces everybody to be Catholic, that here we have a shift, and it is caused by the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment does result, if you got consequences of the Enlightenment, it is very clear that the Enlightenment does result in increased toleration, increased religious toleration. Now, it perhaps doesn't go far enough, but nevertheless, increased toleration. All right, so there are some other Enlightenment thinkers that it's maybe good to know. Diderot with his encyclopedia, the idea that you could catalog all human knowledge. We've got Montesquieu with his 3 branches of government, separation of powers. I think you know Adam Smith with his Wealth of Nations and his idea of the invisible hand and supply and demand. We've talked about that a lot. And of course, Hobbes is a little bit of our odd man out in a sense, because Hobbes's Leviathan argues that you cannot rise against an absolute power. It argues that you do need an absolute power to keep people in check because people are selfish and anarchy will ensue if there isn't a stronger power, absolute power at hand. So he's arguing for absolutism but from a secular perspective. But you need to remember that Hobbes was writing after watching a civil war in England and watching his king, Charles I, have his head chopped off, and he was pretty horrified. So he comes at the idea of absolutism as a good thing, keeping us from sort of anarchy. All right, so our Enlightenment thinkers, I think you really just need to kind of have a general hold on them. You don't need to worry too much about the nitty-gritty, but what I've just sort of said I think is important. And thinking about ways in which they influence the rule that comes next. So, as stated, we have 3 enlightened rulers that you need to know. You need to know Joseph II of Austria, you need to know Catherine the Great of Russia, and you need to know Frederick of Prussia. Now, let's just start with Frederick. So Frederick the Great, he's the one who had to watch his friend have his head chopped off when he was 18 and he'd run off with his buddy, and his dad was not too happy about that and made him watch from the window his friend beheaded. And but like a lot of wayward sons, he actually comes into the fold, and he uses the army that his father left him. His father actually liked his blue boys so much. Remember, Prussia was called Sparta of the North, but he didn't even want to use them because he didn't want any of his soldiers to die. But Frederick does use his army. Maria Theresa is left the throne through the Pragmatic Sanction over in Austria, and when Frederick hears about this, he is an enlightened ruler, but he's also an enlightened absolute ruler, and like all absolute rulers, he's into expansionism. And so he sees an opportunity with a woman on the throne, and he makes a move for it, and he does take Silesia, and he is able to double the Prussian population in one stroke, and he'll spend a lot of his reign trying to defend that move, but nevertheless, that is one of his absolute moves. But one thing that he doesn't do, he never ever talks about divine right rule. He sees himself as a ruler to make the lives of his subjects better. Cameralism is the idea of backing a monarchy, that monarchy is the best form of government, and that all sort of all parts of the state should be run in benefit of that monarchy, but that the monarch in turn needs to act for the betterment of all people in the state, so to speak. And so it's kind of a sort of a utilitarianism, sort of a greatest benefit for the greatest good. But this idea that the monarch needs to be benevolent. And Frederick took that to heart. He wanted his subjects to be happy. He's on the record as saying, I want my subjects to be happy. And he did things like abolish torture, which we would think is a very Enlightenment move. We know that Beccaria was critical of forms of punishment, and we know that Enlightenment thinkers were interested in cleaning up prisons and the like, and none of our Enlightenment thinkers, none of our philosophers are terribly keen on torture, so this is a good move. And again, religious toleration for Christians was another way in which he's an enlightened ruler. But he's not good to the Jews. Even though Moses Mendelssohn is a Jewish thinker, he is the founder of the Haskalah movement in Prussia, which argued that in a time of increased rationality and thought, how could you possibly be intolerant? Arguing, inspiring the greatest Jewish thinkers of the time to sort of make a push for toleration. But even so, even though he's Prussian, Moses Mendelssohn, he is not listened to by Frederick. And Frederick doesn't really do anything for women either. The Enlightenment is not a woman's movement. There are women who are inspired by it, like Olympe de Gouges and Mary Wollstonecraft are 2 examples. But nevertheless, this is a sort of a very male dominated movement, and women don't get much out of the Enlightenment. So I think it's kind of important to remember that. Another enlightened ruler is Catherine the Great. She, like Frederick, was pen pals with Voltaire, friendly with Voltaire. When the French king would not publish Diderot's encyclopedia, she agreed to. She too was interested in abolishing torture, and she too wanted to sort of, like Frederick, play around with the legal system and make it a little bit easier to follow and fairer. She was interested in being fair. But again, she was not kind to the Jews, although she grants religious toleration for any kind of Christian, like Frederick, but she is anti-Semitic, and like most people, or many people, I should say, at the time. And she might have been willing to be kinder to the serfs, except in 1773, remember, Pugachev rises against her, and the peasants follow him, that Pugachev revolt, and she crushes it. Her soldiers crush it, but she was so horrified by the peasants rising up against her that she says, no way am I ever going to, free the serfs. And so she lets her nobles, she says to the nobles, you can do whatever you want with your peasants. I don't even care. You can crush them if you want. So we don't see her being kind to the peasants. But Joseph II of Austria, this is where we do see great movement, increased toleration and sort of kindness. He ruled for a long time with his mother, Maria Theresa, and for a long time, they're interested in agricultural reform. They were interested in, again, playing around with the legal system, kind of making things a little fairer. But when his mother dies and he becomes sole ruler, he goes a little bit further. He, too, abolished torture, but he also abolished the death penalty. And he wanted Jews to be more integrated into society, so he allowed them to enter higher education. He didn't make them wear a distinctive mark. They didn't have to show themselves as Jews, and he encouraged them to speak German. He encouraged them to sort of be more integrated into society. He too freed the serfs. Some of these reforms are going to be undone when he dies. At 49, his brother takes the throne, and some of these are undone, but nevertheless, when we're looking for consequences of the Enlightenment, we're thinking about ways that the Enlightenment is sort of propelling society forward, and we do see that in religious toleration. We do see that in sort of the way that we view torture and that kind of thing as well. All right, let's see. So perhaps the biggest consequence, though, of the Enlightenment, or event consequence anyway, is the 1789 French Revolution. As you know, there was unfair representation in France. The three estates, the Estates General, the first two estates could always outvote the third. The delegate number was the same for each estate, and the first estate, the church, the second estate, the nobles could band together and they could always outvote the third estate. And remember, the nobles and the church were exempt from a lot of the taxes, the vingtième, the 20th, the gabelle, the salt tax, and the taille. And so they didn't pay a lot of taxes, but the third estate, 97 to 98% of the population, bore the brunt of funding France. And remember, an extra evidence source that you can bring in, Abbé Sieyès, when he wrote in his pamphlet, What is the Third Estate? His answer was everything. If you see a political cartoon from this time, this is when if you see one person being crushed by two others, and one of the others on top looks like a churchman and the other looks like a noble, this is the two estates crushing the third estate. So unfair representation, no representation really at all when you think about it. Well, that unfair representation coincided with Enlightenment ideas, which also coincided with France being bankrupt. We know that Louis the 16th, he helped to bankrupt France when he saw an opportunity for revenge by backing the American revolutionaries against Britain. His grandfather had lost the 7 Years' War against Britain. He saw an opportunity to get revenge, but it didn't really work out that way. He just ended up spending. His wife, Marie Antoinette, is also spending Madame Deficit. And so they're not a very popular couple at the time. So there are lots of reasons for the French Revolution, but basically the country was bankrupt. And so Louis' finance minister, Necker, said, why don't you have the Estates General meet? The Estates General did meet, but remember the third estate was locked out, whether accidentally or not, it's difficult to say, but they reconvened at the next door tennis court, not really what we think of when we think of a tennis court, sort of a handball court, and they swore that they weren't going to disband until France was a constitutional monarchy and they were the National Assembly and they spoke for the people. They stormed the Bastille to get gunpowder. They did have, they did get arms, and so they had some teeth to back them up. And all of this falls under the moderate phase of the revolution. And I told you that they're not necessarily moderate in their acts. When they storm the Bastille, they do put the guards' heads on pikes, and it does set a precedent that escalates. But nevertheless, during this period of constitutional monarchy, what we have is it's a moderate stage of revolution. And the Poissards, the women do play a role in this revolution. The Poissards, the fisher ladies, they were angry about the high price of bread, and so they stormed the palace, Versailles, and they forced the king to return to Paris, and really were he sort of lock and key under the National Assembly. He tried to make a run for it with his family. They made it as far as Varennes. They tried to make it to Austria because Marie Antoinette was Austrian. And they were captured and brought back, and then, of course, put on trial for treason. And as you know, they end up, both of them, with their heads cut off.